Hello and welcome to the Crossing the Line podcast. I am National Treasure Charlie Collicott, and joining me, Jawline himself, Oliver Rednall. And joining us today, not one, not two, but three guests. We have with us co-creator and director Lewis Arnold, co-creator and writer Luke Neal, and editor and technically creator as well, Sacha Szwarc. Did I get that right that time?
Very good. Very good.
Yes, there we go. Of the hit ITV show, Des, adapted from Brian Master's book, Killing for Company. Thank you all for coming on.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you for having us.
So with a project like Des, the idea came from the book, was it a treatment that was brought to you, or did you come up with the idea to start adapting it and make it into a TV show?
Well, actually, the idea technically didn't come from a book. The book came after we started investigating the idea of what a show about these crimes would be. And so after that, Brian's book is such a wealth of information, and he himself was such a wealth of information past the book that we actually then decided to start basing stuff. But it's loosely adapted from the book. A lot of the book is mainly about what Nilsen did, and Brian's section is very much in the book, but all of the J stuff was through other means of research as well.
And how long did it take you from starting to finishing the script?
just the script of the whole project.
Well, yeah,
it was 4.5 years from well, it was longer for Luke. So Luke came to me with the idea and had been working on it solo for a little while, but from me it was 4.5 years. For you, it was 5.5 years, I think, Luke. I think you were a year longer than me, weren't you?
Yeah, I was about.
Sacha, did you ever read the book?
I read parts of it during prep, but I didn't read the whole thing, no. I mean, I was trying to kind of keep a distance in terms of approaching the material cold, and I know that it was kind of something that could potentially taint how, I try to, when approaching all sort of material, kind of do some bits of research, but not get too bogged down in it, because I know that would have been a big thing for you guys, and I wanted to try and judge the material as its own thing. And as you know, Lewis, some stuff was eventually removed from the show in the editing process. So
I just don't think I'd ever asked you that question. As Luke was talking about the book, I was like, has Sacha even read the book? Because we never had any kind of like massive intellectual debates about the book whilst we're in the edit.
Yeah, I mean, I picked it up for a bit because I remember it being mentioned, and I mean, I know Killing for Company was a big thing, but I didn't want it to sort of taint how I sort of approach the material.
I feel like we've completely gone off topic.
No. This is great.
This is what we want. This is what we want, so we don't have to.
I mean, Luke saw a documentary, which is where the interest was born from, and then started looking into the research himself, and then found the book. And when he came to me, he'd written a sort of a rough script that included had a massive angle of the press, didn't it? It kind of followed one of the journalists who broke the story. Female journalist from a local paper had a link, and someone basically tipped them off about what was going on Cranley Gardens, and that was a whole thing. And it was only when we sort of lost that strand did we really start to say, actually, the book is kind of really we need the book, we need Brian, because actually that's going to be a bigger component of this, is sort of an interrogation of Nilsen, and not the crimes, but the man himself through that, because I think you could never really question the crimes. Yes, he did the crimes, but a lot of what he said you just can't believe, because he was the only person alive to vouch and say what happened when it did, and the whole point of the drama was to question this man's motivations, the words that were coming out of his mouth, and to try and sort of see that actually he was a narcissist who manipulated those around him to create a narrative that suited him, dependent on where he was in his own narrative, if that makes sense.
Sure. And how was the decision when you've got a true story? How do you go about deciding what stays in the script and what you have to leave out due to the time constraint? Was it 3 episodes when you started writing, or was that ITV's idea to?
No, it was 3 when we started, wasn't it? We pitched it as 3, and then it went to 6 when we met New Pictures. They pitched to us the idea of doing it as like the People versus O.J. Simpson, which we were just, our eyes just lit up, and we're like,
I can imagine that would be great.
They were like, well, they were saying like, let's bring the world into it more. Let's bring, because obviously what it is at the moment in its finished form is very much it's kind of a series of two-handers that kind of pick apart this man who kind of appears from nowhere for many people in terms of society and what he's been doing. But the version that we worked on for quite a while had much more of a wider view on 1980, the press and what was happening and politics, all those things. And we worked on that for a while, and then it became 4. When the ITV took it over, it became 4. And then when we were working on 4 actually was much more difficult than 6. And I think we felt that we were having to invent too much to make it work as a sort of smart 4. And so we made a decision quite late in the day to, with everybody's backing and blessing, to make it as a 3. But that was a natural evolution. Was that fair to say, Luke?
Yeah, it was. The problem with 2 is actually, and weirdly enough, 2 episodes, the episode 2 that we wrote of 4 is actually quite a similar episode that we wrote. It ended up, but we basically had to manufacture the last act of episode 2, not to put because the not guilty would have always gone to episode, the end of the episode 3, which meant that we were just treading water. And actually, we decided that it would have been much easier if we just don't tread water and we make it fast. And I think episode 2 works because it feels so jam packed with stuff that you actually feel that the time constraint on Jay, actually, because he's spinning so many plates at that point, because he's not dealing with one murder, he's dealing with 15, and there is no, and he doesn't know any of their names. And I don't think if we'd have had it 4, we would have felt the pressure on Jay as much as if we do now, I think.
Yeah, and you're also dealing with a sort of a unique story in the sense of the murderer was caught at the beginning. You weren't trying to solve who did these. You had the murderer saying, "This was me," and then the investigation, the process happening after that. So it wasn't a sort of a reveal in the sense of, oh, we've got them, who done it type of thing.
The who done it, yeah. The why done it.
Yeah, that's right.
But that became our USP. We, on all the documents and all the pitches and the emails I would send, over the years, it would constantly be like, the unique thing about this drama is that it's a murder case in reverse. It's a police procedure in reverse. It's you have the murderer, but you don't have the victims. So one thread of it is very much familiar territory for an audience, but it's also quite refreshing. But when you start writing, it becomes really difficult, actually, because investigating bodies and trying to find victims is almost harder than, following a thread of an investigation to find a murderer. Yeah.
He's also so good at hiding evidence. The fact that they found 6,000 fragments of bone in not Cranley Gardens, in Melrose Avenue, and not one of them had enough evidence to identify a body, because he knew how to get rid of the evidence. He knew how to get rid of the bodies. He was meticulous and methodical, and so it meant that it was just an impossible task for the police.
Well, you mentioned something before about you had your facts and you had kind of Brian's take on it, and then you had parts where padding it out is wrong, but you were finding ways to fill the time effectively. How did you find that? How did you find being able to balance kind of the artistic license with the actual truth of the story that Brian told you, and how involved was Brian with kind of giving you that information?
The thing with Brian was incredibly helpful, but only really on what he witnessed. So the police investigation, although he knew a lot about, he wasn't going to give us the details on. For that, we had to talk to members of the squad that investigated it, who were still alive. Sadly, Peter J isn't alive, but had written a autobiography, which was so helpful to us, wasn't it, Lou? Like that.
Yeah,
really...
his son shared it with us. Yeah, it's incredible. There's a whole sort of 2 chapters on the Nilsen case.
Wow.
And Linda, his widow, and his son Simon were massively helpful and really kind of supportive in what we were doing. And the other policemen, Steve McCusker and Brian Lodge. It's a long time ago, Luke. Brian Lodge were were so helpful. They came in and they really did like spend time with us and tell us little nuggets and little things that made them human. Because like the thing is, if you do loads of research before long, they're no longer human beings. They're just information on a page, and it's always all of our jobs to make them human, to make them to make us feel for them, basically. And sometimes information doesn't give you that.
I would argue, though, that at the beginning of the process, maybe for the first couple of years, we were quite flexible and unconcerned with, yes, we wanted to tell as much of the truth as possible, but we took a lot more dramatic license. And I feel that when we were commissioned and we started meeting more people connected to the case, particularly the victims' families, I think the responsibility and weight forced us to reinterrogate certain decisions we may have made. And just, I think as we got closer to filming, we were rewriting as we were filming, Leslie Mead's storyline in this series. We met them quite late and changed her relationship with Jay to add in things that she'd said to us about how she'd been treated. So some of that stuff is not as it happened. She never went to the police station. They went to her house. And obviously, so you take certain dramatic license to make it work and to make it affordable and to make it a coherent narrative. It's not a documentary. It's it's a drama. But at the same time, we very quickly, when we met them and we were in the middle of filming, realized that what they were telling us, it was more important to be truthful to the essence of their experiences with the police than it was, for the story. So I think the more you live with something and the more you get closer to the people connected, I think the more, I think we started to pull away from the dramatic license in question. I think that's when the decision to go from 4 to 3 was born out of, was the fact that we brought a family into it who I think we both felt, once we started meeting people, we felt uncomfortable bringing that storyline into it and bringing those people into it, because we're able to maybe use dramatic license a bit too much.
It's also, isn't it, Lou, why we cut the press angle at the end? Because what we were trying to do, a little bit like they did with Chernobyl, but they did it a lot more successfully than I did it, was kind of, with Emily Watson's character, they kind of put all of the scientists as one scientist, basically. So there were like 100. And we were kind of trying to do that with the press, but it kind of didn't work as well because, the press were awful in this case, but they were universally awful. The Sun, the Mirror, the Express, the Sport, all of them were terrible. But if you do it all through one journalist, you're kind of putting the blame on one paper's door, really. And it felt like it would just, let alone the legal wranglings, the kind of responsibility we started really feeling, Lou and I started really feeling like we wanted to tell the true story of something that had been mistold for 30 years. So we couldn't then just start making stuff up and hope that wasn't hypocritical.
I also think that with the press story, I mean, only because you touch on it, I think one of the things that I think Sacha will vouch for in the edit is that, Brian's story works because really Brian and the police are looking at Nilsen and they're putting a spotlight on Nilsen. The press's spotlight is on the crimes, but it's a completely different. They're not looking at the man. They're creating headlines. It's a very different angle. So that they kind of felt like, whereas what you get with, as it currently is in its current format, is you get these people circling Nilsen and trying to get beyond the facade and try and understand, where the man starts and where the lies begin. And whereas the press never had access to him, so all they're really doing is sponging up and throwing things out there. And so they kind of felt, and even we cut scenes, didn't we, Sacha? There was a scene where the press, we cut a couple of press scenes. There was a scene where Jay turned up at Melrose Avenue and the press are all there and they're having a sort of chat with one of the lead liaison officers for the press, which was a photograph that was taken that we literally pulled together the same photograph, and it was an impromptu sort of chat with the press about where they're up to, and we just pulled them away because they were the first things to go because like they did in the script, they felt like an extra view that we didn't need to lean so hard into actually to experience the press from Des, Brian and Jay's perspective felt much more the show, I think.
Yeah.
We just literally over talked that question. Like I'm so sorry.
We love this. We love not having to talk. We just like hearing about it, and
you can tell why.
It's great having three of you here to sort of hear all three points of view of it as well.
You know now why it took 5 years. It was just talking.
When you were writing, did you have, even if it was just a personal sort of choice in your mind, who would play Des?
When I first met Lou, the first meeting when you were living in Kilburn at the time, we said, wouldn't it be amazing if David played Dennis Nilsen, but let's face it, he'll never do it. And then very early on, so that was in 2015, summer of 2015, and then a friend, like it's a weird story that a friend of mine who's friends with David, a friend of a friend, was talking to him at a dinner party. Do you remember when we could have dinner parties? Well,
back in those days.
Back in those days. And he was talking about Dennis Nilsen, and she said, "Oh, well, my friend's written the script." And so he read it, and I got an email out of the blue saying, "Hey, I'd love to chat about your script. I think it's really good." And it coincided with Lewis getting Broadchurch, and then them forming a relationship. So very early on in 2000, he signed on in 2016. That's right, isn't it, Lou?
Yeah, possibly. If that's when I was doing Broadchurch, yeah. It was pretty much, we spoke over Broadchurch, and by the end he was like, "I'm in, whatever you need, I'm in." And then it was very silent. Well, we just kept updating him when we needed to, because after that it took years to, we sort of shopped it around, we developed it somewhere, it didn't work, we then took it to New Pictures, developed it somewhere and it didn't work out, and then we took it to somewhere else to New Pictures. I think it was only when we started getting into development, and then when we got close, I mean, he got it over the line for us. He
most definitely.
He went and met ITV and sort of, pledged his commitment to it. And, obviously they were desperate for Dave. They wanted to do it with David, but he was attached whenever we went out. It was us two, and David is playing Nilsen, which always got people going. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when we were writing it, when I was writing it, when we were developing it, David was always in our mind. There was no one ever that that was going to play Nilsen apart from David. And I mean, what a performance! I'm so glad he actually did.
And doesn't even a bit archive footage of the real Dennis Nilsen appear in it? And that doesn't happen very often, does it? Normally they get an actor do it. That was really good. I thought
controversial moment.
Really?
Yeah, Sacha.
I thought it was really good. Really good.
Yeah,
I love it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it worked. The decision to use, I mean, it was something that Lewis had always talked about, the idea of archival footage, but it was, it was something we really started to explore heavily once we got into the edit. And I thought it felt tonally right. It didn't feel like we were doing, I think that was always the balance. The balance we strove for is to not feel sensational, or to not, feel ghoulish at any point. Like it's a really fine balance as to how you approach this material. And I think that was something that's, rightly so, people were interrogating the intentions behind seeing the real Nilsen, and what does that do. But I think in the way we did it, with it being the opening of the episode, it thematically matched up with the other episodes. And all is like sort of almost one shot. It's a strong moment, because you really then do, I think you carry that feeling into all the court stuff happening after that, and it just grounds you and reminds you as an audience the fact that this really did happen, because I think it's easy to forget that sometimes. We watch a lot of television, we watch a lot of drama.
I mean, I'd love to see how many people actually just assumed it was David, because it's such a long lens, the camera's so far away, that because that was the big conversation in the edit, was, is it wrong to sort of to essentially to open the curtains and show the audience that the real Dennis Nilsen, because then they're going into an episode where David is playing Dennis, and it's like, that was the thing. People were like, "Oh, are you kind of like breaking the fourth wall?" As in a way. But I don't know. It just worked for me. It almost brought a level of gravity to the episode as well, I think, in terms of reminding the audience constantly the reality that this man existed, and what you're watching is 95% truthful, and if that 5% that isn't truthful is nothing serious, it will just be that it didn't quite happen like that, or
I thought it was a great choice to make, because from a filmmaking, I'm an actor, so from that kind of perspective, noticing slightly more than say maybe a normal audience member would, I was like, that's really good. I think it's a really good choice to have done that, and it kind of surprised me, but didn't take me out of it didn't distract me from what was happening on screen.
I would say, if anything, it causes you to invest yourself more, because you're like, okay, no, this is actually tied in with something that really happened, and we're getting to see that snapshot brought in with the drama.
And people will remember that.
Yeah.
A lot, big audience, a lot of them will remember this actually happening.
The irony is, if Sacha would have let that clip go for like 5 more seconds, he bangs his head on the door as he goes into the van. It's quite a famous clip.
Yeah.
And he's going in, and as he goes in, he hits his head on the door, and then
For that,
we have to, obviously we cut it before that moment, but it's quite a known clip of him. I think it's him being led. It's when he's in custody, but he's not been charged, being led to get his extension for the investigation. Highgate Magistrates Court.
It's also a thing that it became incredibly more important to us to question true crime in itself and why we're fascinated by true crime. And I put that in myself of why am I writing this? And it kind of, I think that bled into a lot of the scenes of why are you watching this? And actually there's scenes which, unfortunately, and it was always through Nilsen, who was, there was a couple of J ones as well, when he says you're so fascinated by him. And that was a real challenge to the audience, but it was also a real challenge to myself of like, why have you spent 5 years trying to get into this man's head? Why are you writing a story about this person? And it became important, really important, to never forget that this man happened, and he destroyed lives, he destroyed families, and so just putting that I think it's genius, and I was so happy when I saw it, because like Sacha said, it just reminds you at the top of the episode, don't ever forget this isn't David Tennant. This is a real person. He did these things. And I think it's just every time that we do that, especially at the beginning as well, with all the Soho and the homeless young men in Soho, I think it's so powerful, because it doesn't let you watch scot-free. It doesn't allow you to just watch inactively about a bunch of actors doing a brilliant performances. It's more than that. It costs more than that. It should cost more than that.
And that wasn't scripted. The original opening of the series, which we filmed, was a young Dennis Nilsen going to the beach and going in the water and trying to drown himself. And we spent a great deal of time and money filming that sequence of a young boy, going out into the water, and which is what Nilsen used to do as a young boy in Fraserburgh.
But it doesn't matter.
To be closer. But and we shot that scene, and it didn't. You have to acknowledge when things don't work. It didn't work. It subjectified too much of Nilsen. And I mean, me and Sacha scratched around in the dark for a while trying to figure out how we opened it. And we just had, we'd used all of this stock footage as part of our research. And I think you came in on us a weekend, didn't you, Sacha? And we were just like, why don't we try? Because what was missing from episode 1, which episode 2 and 3 have, what episode 1 misses, and the danger of episode 1, I think when I first saw it in its assembled state, which I think we spoke a lot about, Sacha, was there was no sense of the victims, because it was about episode 1 is about discovery. And that's the danger with it, is if you don't remind the audience of the time and the victims and how these victims came about and how things could work for him to be able to operate the way he did, it becomes a kind of a piece about a serial killer talking about these horrendous things. And that was the danger with it, I think. And when we conceived, and the first version we had of that sequence was the most powerful. And then we got into problems with the lawyers where we couldn't show faces, because the first version we had, we found so much stock footage of homeless men in London and young and vulnerable people in London in 1980, 80, I think it was like 79 to 83. And there was an incredible sequence Sacha cut, and then obviously you get into it with the legal team, and you're not allowed to show faces. So what Sacha had to do is try and create a sequence where you get a feel for a community and a people that were kind of had moved to London for opportunities and then found no opportunities and found themselves in a very vulnerable position without actually seeing any of those people's faces. And that was a challenge right until the end, because the first version we had, I still think if we'd been able to show it, improved the whole episode, because again, it just reinforced the faces of these men and these people who found themselves in this position through no fault of their own.
Yeah, and Sarah's score on it is incredible.
Absolutely.
It's so beautiful. That it just opens the show, and it's like it's so like, this is not going to be an easy watch, and it's not. And you know, I think, yeah, I understand what you were talking, but I think you do a great. I think what we've got with is fantastic. Like, I obviously saw the first cut, and it is brilliant, because it, like you say, it's focused on people's faces, and for the rest of the show, we're going to talk about people that are invisible because Nilsen's hidden them, and but I still think what we have. I think Sacha did such a great job in, like you say, in creating that community and showing London of that time, and that just framing the whole episode and framing the whole series, actually, of what this is really about.
Charlie and I were talking just before about editors and how they don't get enough. People don't realise the difficulty and how much pulling. It's not just editing everything together; it's making artistic choices and then dealing with problems constantly, yeah. And it's a huge responsibility. And do you ever? What sort of challenges do you face? You talked about the one about having the homeless people and giving the time of London at that time. But what other challenges do you think you faced during this production?
Well, I think it's probably sort of the kind of things you run across. I'm trying to think now, back to it. I would say it was always about this idea of sort of subjective and objective, and like how we're viewing the characters, essentially. Because there were, and you know, you start off with the whole thing as it was scripted, etc. And then sometimes you watch it through, and it's then about where are we putting emphasis, and how are we bringing the audience through this story? How are we taking them through it? And I think that was always the challenge, was with Nilsen, of like, how much do we show, how much do we hold back? You know, how much do we reveal of this character? What are we saying? And I mean, there were other scenes that were written and shot where we spent more time with Nilsen in the prison system. You know, these were real events that took place. And it's funny, it's that, you know, on the page, they were great. Like, I mean, I really enjoyed them as scenes. But then you suddenly find that when you see it on a run, it unbalances things slightly, and it gives it a different feeling, and it feels as though we're trying to create a statement of what people should be feeling about this character, that we should maybe be pitying him or feeling sorry for some of his predicaments, and I think that was a big danger, was, you know, trying to kind of keep him enigmatic, be engaged. We want to be interested in what's going on, and we want to be fascinated in the same way as these two men, as Jay and Brian, and investigating this character and this person and trying to understand him from two different angles. And I think that was when we sort of figured, that felt like a breakthrough in some senses, of pulling back on those scenes and being like, this is how we're approaching this character, Nilsen, is we're coming at him from Jay's point of view and from Brian's point of view. And they're two very different points of view, but both valid. Both have merit in how they're approaching it.
You mentioned at the beginning of our chat, you purposefully kept yourself detached.
Yeah.
You didn't read up on it. You literally got the footage at the end and started doing it. Do
Yeah.
you feel that helped you with kind of being able to give these two very valid but different viewpoints on the same thing?
Yes. I mean, I did. I think it's that thing of like, it's a balance of like, you want to do enough research that you don't feel like you don't know what's going on about the story. Like, I understood the story and I knew the historical moments, and then continued to exhaust all of the archive footage I was going through and selecting all that. So that was helping set me in the world, as it were. But then I think it is important to have like a distance in terms of, you know, they've both lived with this project, Luke and Lewis, for so long, that it's important then to come to it with a fresh perspective. And in that sense, it's like, I'll have a go at scenes. You know, Lewis is, you know, very collaborative, and I have a chance to sort of approach the scene on my own terms. And then sometimes I'll see something differently than to how it was perhaps envisioned. And that, you know, those little mistakes or you know, nuances, or what sort of elevate the thing to a different place, because they're like, oh, I actually didn't see it that way, but that's interesting. This is, a new approach we can try and, run with, and let's see where it takes us. So in that sense, I think it is important, in the same way that it's not necessarily beneficial to have an editor on set. It's better to be distant, to not have, to judge it on its own merit, to judge the material as it stands without everything that went into it, if that makes sense.
I can't remember if it was me and Sacha or me and someone the other day were talking about the role an editor plays in regards to performance, because I think there's a thing that people assume that, you watch a piece of TV or a film and you go, wow, that performance. And yes, that is a lot of that is the actor. You can't craft a great performance. You can't edit it from a bad, but you have to have a good performance.
Of course.
But it's not like theatre where it is all the actors. It's like the decisions that are being made, the choices of takes, the choices of when to cut, all that stuff are elevating a performance.
And music as well over the top.
Everything.
And choices of colour. I think Ollie's got this great story about Star Wars, which we were talking about earlier. The early cuts.
I'm reading the editor's autobiography. He was Brian De Palma's editor as well, and he said about how there's a scene where the lightsabers are first brought on, and how the scene didn't make sense. So then the editor said, let's just switch those around. Then the order that you see it in was never the intended order, and then it just makes perfect sense. And it really highlights these sort of even iconic moments like that was down to the editor's choice.
Yeah.
And like performance, I always say that to people. They say, oh, what a great performance. I said, well, maybe it was just really good editing as well, or really good music.
Oh, I think it has to be a combination, doesn't it? I don't think a bad performance can be made to be
of course,
great.
Unless you just cut it completely, then
But
also about the writing. Don't ever forget that.
That's right.
Of course.
Well, it all starts in the script. But no, I think editing is so valuable, and we spend a lot of time. And the big thing we did with Des, which was the episodes were massively over, as they were on the show. With the show we've just literally finished cutting. The episodes were very, very long, and with both Des and Time, they're very slow paced purposefully, particularly Des, because you're observing and watching and trying to understand and see a character through other characters' eyes. The problem with that is when you've got overlength episodes, the general consensus is we'll just cut everything down, get it working. And we had to basically protect the performances and the space of the performances and try and protect David's performances and his choices and Brian's choices, Jason Watkins and Danny's choices, by lifting whole scenes out. And that was something we decided, and it was something we did on Time as well, where we sometimes would, to protect an overall performance, would sacrifice something that we thought we loved but that we could live without in favor of not, because often in television you've got 47 minutes, whatever it is, it can be quite pacey and you don't get a chance to settle and to be still. And that was really important with Des, was that you found moments to be still and to watch and to make up your mind and be given the time by the filmmakers to make up your mind and have a conversation in your head about what is going on with this guy. This feels like narcissism, and if it's all too quick, you don't get any of that internal debate. So that was a big challenge, I think, was finding the pace.
The talent that it's on the cutting room floor, the acting talent, people like the amazing Lex Shrapnel, Faye McKeever had massive, and she did brilliant work, and it was a fantastic performance. It just, unfortunately, when it was a choice between these brilliant scenes that didn't, because we had a lot of Jay's personal life throughout, to kind of mirror his father, him being a father and him coming to terms with fatherhood whilst, searching for people that had kind of lost their fathers, in the sense that they and then they ended up homeless. And although the scenes were great, and the performances from people like Lex and Faye were brilliant, they just didn't connect with the story. And I personally, that was me also as a slightly inexperienced writer, not being able to connect the DNA of those scenes in the show to the investigation. They were, they ended up being able to be cut. I think, but I don't think it was anything to do with the writing. I think there's, they were very connected in the sense of, as you said, the point of those scenes was a father who
isn't seeing his kids and has issues with in the ability to see his kids as the same way the fathers that are looking for their sons who have gone. And I think, I think inevitably, whenever you cut, as me and Sacha find on every job, there is stuff that most things can go, that because everything isn't just plot driven. There's everything that's character driven can go, but it's at what decrement to the overall sense of the show and the audience's experience. So yeah, I don't think those scenes went because of the writing. I think it was just a choice. It was a choice we made.
Absolutely not. It wasn't because of the writing. Yeah, no. I mean, it was
because of Lex's terrible performance.
It's because of my direction.
And here is the truth, ladies and gentlemen, coming out.
From when you finished the shoot, obviously you probably watched it hundreds of times in the edit room, but from when you finished it to when it was broadcast, how did your feelings change about the project, having time to sort of step back from it a little bit?
I hate everything. You ask any actor that's ever worked with me, like if an actor that comes close to me, they very quickly learn to because I can't hold. I shoot very straight as well, and I wear my heart on my sleeve. And I remember ironically when we were doing Time, I spoke to Luke and I just watched the first cut, and I said to Luke, it's a disaster. It's awful. And Luke just laughed, and I was like, "What are you laughing at?" He said, "Lewis," he said, "when we were doing Des, and I called you when you just watched the first cut with Sacha, and you called me and you said it's the worst thing I've ever seen. The only person getting out of this with any dignity is Danny, David, and Jason. The rest of us are screwed.
It's going to be a 1-star. It's going to be a 1-star." And I found out though, Lou, that the reason you called me to tell me is because you said that to Lewis's wife. And she said exactly what I said. And said, "You always say that." And so he didn't get the satisfaction from worrying someone. So he phoned me to tell me that my career was basically over.
I didn't. It wasn't that. It was to tell you how worried I was. And anyway, and then as Sacha knows, because Sacha has to deal with my emotion all the time, you then go on a journey with it, and through the edit, you start to find it, and then when we finally get episode 1 to a point where I'm kind of roughly happy, I then start moaning about how bad episode 2 is. Yeah. But by the time we got to the end of Des, I think because it had been a long time, even when we'd finished and it was mixed and graded and I'd got links to it, I was really, I think it's fair to say, I mean, Sacha, you're probably the closest person in terms of that stage, but I didn't know what to think of it, and I didn't know if it was. I was nervous that it could fail because it'd been such a part of my and Luke's life for so long. Mm-hmm. I was worried in a way. I think I had this thing where I was like, "Is this just me being indulgent?" And I've just it's like an indulgent piece that me and Luke wanted to make. And does it have any value? Should it have even been made? I think I'd started to think about that conversation, which inevitably comes up when a show of this nature comes out, which is did you have a right to tell this story? Yeah. So for me, I think I only kind of rewatched it and kind of started to not be happy with what we achieved. I think when I started filming Time, I think it was because I had this, so it was after the review. I think when the reviews came out and there was a positivity around it, I was like, okay. But it was probably another 6 weeks after that I watched it again and was like, actually, I'm quite proud. And it's like, the irony is, I literally said in a meeting the other day, the thing I've just done, I don't know whether it'll even do half as well as Des, but I'm already really proud of that. And I don't know if it's because that is something I've come on as a director that I haven't developed for 5 years. So I kind of come on it last year, worked hard on it with everyone, and then kind of walked away from it. So I've maybe found a way to look at the work objectively. Whereas Des, for me personally, it took a long time to be able to find an objective, to be able to stand back from it objectively enough to be happy. I mean, I was always proud that we got it made, but that's different than being proud of the work, if that makes sense. I was proud of everyone else's work on it, but it was hard for me. Yeah, it's complicated. It
sounds a bit like, when you we're both actors, and when we're doing self tapes or something, and you look at it back and you go, God, my voice sounds shit, my hair looks awful, everything is terrible. You look at the other
hair
people,
does look awful at the moment.
They're amazing, but I'm obviously the worst person in the world here. You end up kind of building that muscle to actually, like you said, objectively look at it and go, no, this is good.
What we didn't get for Des, which you would usually get, and I think this is the we didn't get a premiere, we didn't get a screening, we didn't get to sit in a room with a bunch of people and watch it. So whenever we watched it, it was only be with one person. And weirdly, when it came out, I watched it with 6 other people, because we were allowed 6 other people at that point in the house. And what struck me, and I thought we were going to be destroyed, because the first scene with Nilsen talking at the first interview, everyone started laughing. They were just laughing because they just couldn't believe what was coming out of this man's mouth. It wasn't like laughing and I was like, that's not what we were going for. But the thing, because we watched it, we watched all three of them together. And what was brilliant was by episode 2, they're not laughing anymore.
It's been really modest. It was quite a room as well of who's who, that room.
Yeah.
Because Luke was an actor for years, he knows everybody. And I remember I got a random text from, I won't say unless you're going to say, but I got a random text from one of the guys being like, Lewis, I got your number off Luke, really loved it. And I was like, what's going on? And then Luke was like, yeah, I've just watched it with X, 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 and X. And I was like, bloody hell, I'm glad you didn't tell me that before.
But it wasn't. But by episode 2, they'd stopped laughing. They didn't find him funny anymore. They didn't like him anymore. And I think that's something I would say about what I think the biggest success of it is. By the time that Des finishes, we're not interested in Nilsen anymore. We're actually interested in the people that are around it and the people that are affected by it. And that's something I'm really proud of, that we made a true crime that kind of pulled it away from the crime itself and said, well, look at the people it affected. Even the people that survived or investigated or went into a room with him, such as Brian, they all came out as victims of Dennis Nilsen. And because he is chaos and he creates chaos, because he's a vacuum which just sucks people in. And I think David's egoless performance of showing himself to be so ugly and such an ugly person in it is tremendous. And I think a lesser actor would have instinctually tried to make him the hero of those scenes, but David's incredible. And it just kind of, so when I watched it, the first time I watched it, I knew that there was something special in David and Danny and Jason. That 3 performances are just special.
Yeah. You talked before about him kind of being that vacuum for everybody's emotion and energy and all that. There's that character Karl Slaughter. Slaughter, sorry. And he's just a perfect example of a person who wasn't killed by Dennis, but was destroyed
still
by
suffering.
him.
Destroyed. Yeah. And his story is horrendous. It's a horrendous story of a life lost, even though he survived. And for the rest of his life, a huge part of him had died. And he was, he had such a sad life up to when he died only a few years ago. And we wanted to tell his story because it felt prevalent, it felt important, and Laurie gives a sensational performance.
He's also really interesting because his is the one story. I'd say the biggest thing with this show, of all the true crime things that I've been a part of or that I'm developing, is that with this one, there are a lot of times when we had to pull back from the truth. And Karl Slaughter is one of those times. The reality was that they knocked on his door and they said sleep. They had a chat with him and they said sleeping bag, and he had a seizure there and then. And when he came round from the seizure in hospital, he started to remember all these things that he basically put down as a bad dream. And I think in the initial version we plotted and that Kelly wrote, we all felt, and me and Luke felt particularly strongly, that when you read that, it felt written. And I don't think people would have believed it as it was, and ironically it was written as exactly as it happened in real life. And that was one of the biggest challenges of episode 3, was how do you deliver Karl Slaughter in a way where the audience of this show believe it, you don't do a disservice to him. And it was one of those few times we had to keep actually bringing it back from the truth and actually like lessening what actually happened to him. For example, when he came out of the courtroom, he was spat at and people shouted homophobic rhetoric at him, but he was spat at and we pulled that back. So it's just one person screamed something homophobic at him. But, what Karl went through was horrific. And actually, I don't think we ever quite. We didn't do it as it actually happened. So you could argue we didn't do it the full justice. But I think Laurie, as an actor, and he was the only person we saw for that role. We saw him. We saw him in Sun, and Luke arranged for us to go meet the cast after, and he didn't know at that point, but we were basically meeting him to see what he was like. And then I think the next day we called his agent and got him in the room, and then we cast him. It was one of those few times. You know, the great thing about working with Luke is he has a really great eye for actors, and he said to me, "You have to see this kid." You know, I saw him and I auditioned him and offered it him, and it was the easiest part I think I've ever cast in my life. It was, and I think Laurie brings such an emotional pain and weight and gravitas to the part that it didn't matter that we didn't do the extremities of what really happened to Karl. I think you see from Laurie that that the damage that's going to do beyond the screen, and you know, Karl Slaughter, it affected him in ways. You know, the rest of his life, his life was dictated by what happened to him on that evening.
How long did the whole shoot take, from start to finish?
Oh God, that's a really good question.
It was 7 weeks.
It was just under 7. I think it was
just
6.
We had
4 days, 6 3 days, because we had 2 days. Naively, now we had 2 days filming in a prison in Shepton Mallet. Yeah. Of which, as Sacha said earlier, we cut.
Oh, really?
80% of the material, and those 2 days would have been very useful. You know, in terms of rushing through some of the other things. Yeah, it was a really tight schedule, but yeah, no, we.
Although, Lou, sometimes you do yourself a disservice, because actually sometimes, because the time constraint, my favourite shot is because of a time constraint, which is the one shot as the when Nilsen says no comment. That was because we just didn't have time for all those setups, and that for me still gives me goosebumps when I watch that shot, which is just slowly panning into and it allowed Danny and David to just go at each other, and it's a magical scene. So what the time constraints you had, because of, you know, make you blush now, but because of the talent that you have, sometimes make brilliant decisions for you, and they mean that you can't do the things that you wanted to do, but actually they're happy accidents.
Yeah, I mean, that's too kind. It's you know, anyone that's been on a film set knows that the director, it's the talents of a crew really more than anything, and the ability of a crew to not just myself, but yeah, the cinematographer, the grip. Yeah, it's no, you're not wrong. I think limitation creates creative solution, but you know, ask any director and they'd always want more time.
I tell a story which I actually haven't told you, Lou. I tell a story about what it's how amazing you are on set, which is like you're so.
Can we
calm.
Stop this now?
No. But listen, honestly,
we've set this up just as an ego rubbing moment.
There's a sting in the tail. Don't worry. So what you do is you're so calm to everyone, and you're really calm to the actors, and you're just really relaxed. And I'm sat by the monitor. And then you're talking to the crew and you're joking with the crew, and then you sit next to me, you look at me with these like really serious eyes and goes, "We're not going to make today." And then you go back, and then just like, and so suddenly I had the secret. It was almost like you would turn to me and go, "Everyone listen, everything's going to be fine," and then you look at me and you go, "We're all going to die," and then you would carry on.
And I've learned, but it's you kind of learn, and the irony is we always completed the days.
We did,
but the irony is, that's the same as me in the edit when I watch it. I think I catastrophize things. But what I've learned is that I do catastrophize things, and there's only certain people I can share that with, which is Sacha, you. In the case of Des, it was very much David Minty, the producer, and on time it was Simon Maloney. You know, Simon would come up to me and I'd be like, you know, I'd like offload to him, and then he'd go speak to the first Graham, who I often work with and I adore, and he'd be like, Graham would be like, "It'll be okay, don't worry." But it's because I wouldn't do it openly to the crew, because I know in my head that I catastrophize things slightly. But you learn about yourself. The older you get and the more experience you get, you learn about yourself, and you manage those insecurities, which is what they are. And I think actors have them, and actors have to manage them because you're front and center. So you kind of have to manage them in a different way. And
So what we should know is, as actors, if we ever get the chance to work with you, is if you ever tell us, "Oh, it's all going great," we should be shitting ourselves.
The head will just turn and you just go, "Okay, we know where we are now."
It's worse
True.
if you're an actor that I actually like feel I can speak the truth to, because then you're in on the catastrophe and you're like, oh, fuck. Yeah,
true.
that's quite worrying.
Are you allowed to tell us what you're working on at the moment, Luke?
At the moment, yeah, I'm doing. I'm currently in development for something about the News of the World hacking scandal.
Oh, that'd be great.
So that's I'm going to work with a different director because I hate Lewis. No, I'm working with Saul Dibb on that, and then Lewis and I have got a few things that we're currently in development, which we can't say anything about yet.
Yeah, one in particular that's we're hopefully going to start writing soon.
Yeah, we are. Yeah.
Good.
So
in about 5-6 years' time, we should see that.
Yeah.
So in another 5 years,
yeah, exactly. But we do fight. The last thing I say is like Lewis and I do fight like brothers when we collaborate.
No, that's not what people call us. People call us a married couple.
Married couple. And we scream at each other in rooms, and people just like kind of look at the floor, and we scream at each other, and we realize that we're screaming at each other using the same point, and actually we're agreeing with each other, and actually we can just carry on. But the people that were developing
we've made people feel very uncomfortable at times. We're both very stubborn, but then we literally within minutes we're like we're both very we're too similar.
Yeah, exactly. We are. Right. Well, thank you very much.
Luke, thank you
very much.
Right, now he's gone.
Now all the gossip on Luke. What?
I was going to ask, what kind of camera did you use to shoot this?
I think it was an Alexa. I think it was an Alexa Mini.
It was.
Was that down to the cinematographer, the DOP?
Yeah. It's always Generally, I don't specify cameras. I obviously talk about lenses more importantly, and we do lens tests, and then we do a thing where we get the tests and we grade them, and we create what's called a LUT. Do you know what that stands for, Sacha? I don't.
It's a lookup table, I think.
Oh, there you go.
He thinks,
which is basically it puts a basic grade on the images, and the idea with that is that when people are watching Sacha's cuts, there is a rough idea of how the show will look.
Sure.
And I've been doing that for a couple of years now, because I find that it means that when execs watch cuts over and over, they become used to how it's going to be, instead of kind of seeing a non-graded image and then getting used to that. And then when you put the grade on it, people have been a bit nervous of that. But I work very closely with the cinematographer and the colorist to do that. But the camera body itself, it's just not something that matters to me.
And location-wise, how did you go about selecting the locations that you used, especially the exteriors?
I mean, locations is like every job. Like locations is my is the thing I'm always really hard on, because it's like it's a real shame that there isn't a locations award. We have awards for editing, we have awards for production design, and I always say that cinematography and production design start with location. A cinematographer can't make a rubbish space look brilliantly, and a designer can't design out of thin air. I mean, they can. In reality, in a studio, they do. But what I mean by that is, if you give them great locations, they can give you great design. And locations aren't recognized half as much as they should. And whether that means that we have to change the cinematography, image awards so that they embrace locations, design, and cinematography and lighting, then we should do that, because it's a huge part of what goes into making any film or TV show. It's a huge part of storytelling. A location is kind of more important and a bigger, more important part of storytelling than what camera we shoot on, because location informs story and says something about characters, stories, tone. Whereas what body or camera you shoot on, the audiences aren't that receptive to that. So with Des, it was tricky. We had a scout go out very early doors. We were considering shooting in Ireland. So I went out there and recorded in Ireland. And in the end, we ended up filming in London for reasons not related to the show. We searched high and low for everything we could, and we had to keep changing the scripts because shooting 1980s London in London is very difficult now, and it's probably the hardest thing I've ever done, shooting on Onslow Gardens, which is like 4 streets down or 3 streets down from Cranley Gardens, because we couldn't find those houses. The Cranley Gardens house is so distinctive. The Melrose Avenue one we cheated, and we actually went for something much different because they were very similar and we didn't want the audience to be confused. But we searched everywhere for those locations, and then I think those were the hardest days on set I've ever had, because you plan things down to an X amount, and it was really tricky on the day, because people that live in here and here don't want to move their cars, and so you can't then look that way and that way and that way, and there was a lot of that stuff. So yeah, period London was particularly tricky. But at the same time incredibly rewarding, I think, when you got into the edit and bits of it work. And locations were so important. We had a great location manager, Sparky, Mark Ellis, who was great, and his team were brilliant. And and there was a scout early on called Joel Holmes, who I'd worked with on Broadchurch, who's a location manager in his own right, who found sort of a lot of stuff for us as well. So we kind of had a head start when we started. But yeah, locations are incredibly key.
And this question for both of you: if you had to give advice to either like your younger self or someone who's seeking or looking into doing what you do, what would it be?
To be patient. And
you stole mine.
we can do. It's because we've been talking about this stuff. But like, I think to be patient, and I think if it's to like myself or like a younger self, it's probably to be like patient and like kinder to yourself, because we can all be quite hard on ourselves sometimes, and it's a long road, and you have to be patient. Like, it's not all going to happen at once. I think as a general piece of advice to anyone who is actually wanting to edit or is starting to edit, I think you've got to go into it with an openness and be willing to go, certainly in the early days, to work on anything and everything, and just really try to expand your palette, as it were. And not because it's like, I think there's sometimes this pressure where you feel like you need to be cutting a feature by the time you're 25, and you need to be this amount of success, and it just doesn't work like that. And I think you need to sort of be patient and try lots of things. I've worked in multiple disciplines of documentary, commercials, music videos, and I know I always wanted to work in film and TV. That's always been my dream and my passion, but I didn't come straight at it. I came at it from the side, and all of those things have some of those things I still do and I really enjoy, and others I don't. But it's all informed how I approach the work, and I think that's important. And I think having sort of interests outside of the work is important too, because you can sometimes have a real kind of tunnel vision, which is good. You need that when you're working. You need to be laser focused. But it's good to have other stuff too, like art, reading, music, whatever.
Something that's at a different tempo. Because I imagine if you're working on something like this, which is quite dark, gritty, it's about people whose lives have been ruined. Yeah. You can't stay in that frame of mind all the time, can you?
No. You have to have a distance, or you do like lose your mind. Like, it's like I tried to keep a real, and touching on what we talked about earlier, like I tried to not go like too deep into like heavy research, because it's like I was living with that footage every single day and hearing those conversations every single day and watching multiple takes of Karl Slaughter describing how he was being what happened to him, and I think that can become quite heavy to live with that, so you got to try and keep a distance.
And also whether you're editing, directing, or acting isn't about acting, editing isn't about editing, it's about life. So bringing those things outside and allowing it to influence your work is important, I think, and character building and everything that surrounds that.
Absolutely.
I think it's why a lot of people in lockdown, have started podcasts, or, I wrote a book when we were editing Des and doing the post on Des. I wrote a book, which I didn't really write. I got other people to write for me. But what I did was I got 100 directors to answer the same 5 questions about how they got started, and then kind of pulled it all together and managed to get finance for it. It's called Directors Now. It's online. It's free to download for anybody interested, but it's on www.directorsnow.com. Bit of a plug. But what I mean by that is, I think, like you say, like if you don't, you have to have life. And I think a lot of creatives have found it tricky not being able to have life. And so I've done actually other artistic, other pursuits that maybe they wouldn't have done if they were able to just keep doing what they're doing. So I think we've seen a lot of people sort of branch out and try, podcasts or, whatever it is, filmmaking and all sorts of stuff. TikTok, random celebrities that you never thought you'd see TikToking or, So I think, I think you're totally right. It was one of the things we were forced to at film school, was to go and explore things, go to theatre, do things that you wouldn't do. Don't just keep watching movies if that's what you do already. Go to the museums and look at art. Try to find a way to broaden your horizons and find ways to be inspired by life. But it's been hard to do that at the moment. With a lack of life in some ways. A lack of access to the kind of things we used to.
And very finally, we always ask our guests: is there a film or films you're ashamed you haven't seen?
That's a great question.
When you get that, I haven't seen that movie. What do you mean you haven't seen? Insert film.
Yeah, I reckon there's probably loads for me.
There's probably we've talked about it in the edit. I haven't seen Schindler's List. That came up in the edit with Lewis the other day.
Wow.
I know,
and I was shocked.
Yeah, and he was like, "How have you not seen that?" See, everybody's
Lawrence of Arabia.
Really?
Lawrence of Arabia.
That's a good one.
Okay.
Yeah, I've had that one before. Yeah.
So
interesting.
Schindler's List is the first time that's come up.
Yeah, Star Wars is one that people say often.
Yeah,
loads of people.
I've had people say that to me, and I don't believe it as well. I just don't believe how often that's on ITV during I just don't. I think people just like to say that as a point of I don't know.
It's kind of an elitism, isn't it? Yeah, no, I haven't seen that.
I think so. I'm trying to think if there's a film franchise that you must have seen. I mean, horror. There's a couple of horror films I probably haven't seen because I'm quite horror. Yeah, I have a very active imagination, so sometimes horror
is a bit
leaves a lasting impression on me.
Yeah, I'm very much the same, and I know plenty of people tell me, "Oh, have you seen 28 Days Later or something?" And it's a bit like, well, no, because the idea of shitting myself at 1 o'clock in the morning does not do it for me, honestly.
Yeah, if I recommend something, but is it scary? I'm like, well, just watch it. It's an hour and a half or something. Like, you'll get through it. It's fine.
Yeah.
Oh dear.
But gentlemen, thank you very, very much for joining us.
Thank you.
It's
Thank
been
you for having
us. Pleasure.
Fantastic. I thoroughly enjoyed the series. Anyone who hasn't seen it, I recommend they go out and watch it now. It's on ITV.
I think it's
Player.
still on ITV.
It is.
ITV, yeah.
It is.
Brilliant. There we go.
If
Another
not,
plug.
Yeah, absolutely. And but thank you very much for joining. It's been great.